nothing I knew had any chance against death. Virginia Woolf.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Holt.
And I'm Lee Esses.
Welcome to Spooky Month. It is my favorite month, October. And traditionally, we have done things every October to talk about magic, the spooky things, about dark psychology and monsters. Now we're going to take this month to talk about death. Another name that you can call this month is We're Getting on the FBI Watch List, so you don't have to.
Just as a fair warning, if you are squeamish or if you have younger listeners with you, then feel free to take a look in our archives and find some other good notes of stuff that you want to listen to and learn about. Because we are kind of getting into the nitty-gritty when we talk about how to kill characters, not just the emotional context, which we've covered in other episodes, but the types of things that happen to a body when they die a certain way.
Other things that we'll get into will include the personality of the killer and historical context if it's needed for different modes of death.
Now, death is kind of a weird thing to write about, especially if you're writing from the point of view of somebody who is dying, because even though we will all experience it in our lifetimes at the end, none of your readers has really experienced the final parts of it for themselves. So there is a little bit of leeway as far as the light at the end of the tunnel moment.
And you can have hints and ideas of what it might feel like. We've all felt pain. Many people know what it feels like to have something like a heart attack or what it feels like to be stabbed. So there's familiarity with the pain of it, but not necessarily with the death of it. And most people will also be familiar with the effects of death on the people around the person who died.
So today we're talking about the actual moments and something to describe the moment of death, not any particular method, which will be the rest of the month.
So when it comes to the setup, where someone dies can be just as indicative of who that person is, what they do with their life, and how important this particular moment in their life was for them.
This physical location can also tell a lot about the mood prior to the death. So when you are setting up that a character is about to die, it can be a very different mood for the reader if the castle is made from fruity pebbles and rainbows and unicorns, or if they're in a castle of ancient ruins covered in black mold and dead climbing ivy.
How you do the setup will also change on whether this is something like a murder mystery and this is the first death in a series and you're just kicking off the book versus the death of a really important character later on in the book. You often will end up doing a jump scare or shock for that first death. It's going to be a surprise for the main character. They're going to walk in on it. But you aren't going to do that same kind of shock jump scare of a death for a character that we have seen develop and grow and change, because that would be a disservice to that character.
Whomever you're killing last in your book is also very important, because that is what all of the rest of the deaths are building toward. You have this and then there were none Agatha Christie style, where the first one can be a surprise to the reader, but the rest of them are somewhat anticipated. So the last one on the list should be important.
When you are preparing to kill a character, especially later in the book, you want to make sure you're aware of the unanswered questions, the unanswered dreams and desires from that dead character, because it's often the arcs that are cut short that are the most tragic.
Something else to consider when you're setting up to kill a character is if the character is fighting back against death. This is something that is very unique to your character and the way you've built them. And if they were preparing for it and those preparations failed, or if they knew it was going to happen and they made stuff to work around it so that their will can still be done.
Once you've done the setup and you kill the character, there are physical things that you need to take into consideration at that moment of death. One of the first things that you may encounter, breath rattles. It's basically if a lung is punctured and there's liquid blood getting into the lungs, as they breathe, it's going to be this kind of crackling, rattling sound before their breath finally stops.
Another thing to keep in mind is that those muscles, they will seize up and like every muscle will flex right at the moment of death, and then they go very limp. So if your point of view character is a murderer, they're much better off moving the person while they're still alive, because once all of those muscles are limp, they become much heavier and they're much more difficult to move.
And probably one of the grosser aspects of death, no matter the kind of death that it is, that instant that all those muscles relax, the bowels empty, because there's no longer muscle tension holding it back.
The blood will also stop pumping in the character. So if your character is bleeding out, then they don't get to continue to bleed after death. This is the more or less medical definition of death, is the heart stops beating. Along with this lack of blood, the hands are going cold and the skin is going pale, simply because the blood's not getting there and keeping it warm and colorful.
And another thing to consider is that the eyes will often glaze over. This is because the eyes are becoming unfocused. The muscles in the eyes aren't working properly, so they're just going to fuzz and unfocus. And it gives it this glazed over look.
Of course, when one character is witnessing another character die, this is not just about the physical things that they're experiencing, it's about the emotional and psychological as well. So when taking into account that emotional trauma that the character is going through, something like the stages of grief, which we've done a whole episode on, can be very helpful in helping your character deal with, at least in the immediacy in order to get out of the bad situation, deal with the death that they're experiencing around them.
All death can impact the characters around them, whether or not they know the person who died. There is a weight to the realization that a life has ended.
Another beautiful thing to write into this emotional context of the death is the sacrifice. This person took the place of the death instead, which makes it that much more emotional. Of course, this is a choice that you're making in the scene, but it's something to consider when you're writing this moment.
And there's something to be said when it comes to survivor's guilt. It's not just that it could have been me or it could have been someone I loved, but sometimes it's it should have been me, guilt attached to it. Another thing that will often come out of a character death, especially an emotional, weighty one, is that the beliefs of the character who died can linger in those they encountered. A really good example of this recently is the epic saga, where Polites sings an entire song about greeting the world with open arms, and then Polites dies, and we see this theme of greeting the world with open arms continue on with Odysseus.
The last thing to consider as far as the emotional context of witnessing a death is the relationship to the deceased. And I'm not just talking about if they're a grandparent or a child or whatever, but the amount of time that they spent together and the amount of time that they could have spent if this sequence of events hadn't happened. That's especially why a lot of parent bearing a child can be very dark and difficult and emotional, is because there's all of this potential that is no longer met.
And the final aspect of death that we want to talk about is the psychological, and how different people will approach and deal with death. No matter what, death is hard, whether you expect it or not. But the expectations of death really do play a role in how the other people around will handle it. If they expected it, it's going to be slightly easier because they have been preparing for it. And then on the other side, once that death has occurred, there is going to be a shock, regardless of preparation. There is always a moment of that kind of, again, stages of grief. The denial is often associated because of the shock of that death. And this is going to be more impactful if the death itself was a surprise to the people around.
Yeah, an unnatural death or supernatural, as the case may be. as compared to something that was expected. Because if the group of friends just got out of seeing a movie in the theaters and then they go, oh, we should explore this haunted house. And right as the first one walks through the door, something wipes him out. It's like, oh, shock, surprise, this is all dangerous now. That shock will resonate throughout the rest of the characters, throughout the rest of the story.
And the final thing, when it comes to the psychology of it, is how different people will behave differently. This is something brought up a lot in the true crime realms, where people's reactions to having a loved one die is never predictable. And so you can never judge how a person is acting to determine guilt involved in the death. Because some people will just go full shutdown, while others will go into like a full-blown panic spiral. And another thing to consider with this is the profession and experience of each person involved is going to play a role. You're going to have people who are in law enforcement or military are more likely to be able to handle death better in the short term than somebody who has never once had somebody die close to them.
So an answer to all of these questions in regards to what your character would do, how your character would deal with these particular events. That is a lot of what makes the character interesting and helps you choose which point of view to write the scene from. So when you are putting together your story and deciding how best to do this traditionally very difficult scene, I encourage you to look at the whole story and then bring it back to what is most important to your character and most important to yourself, and then
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.